This podcast represents the opinions of our hosts and guests. The content here should not be taken as medical advice and is for informational purposes only. This podcast also does not establish a standard of care, doctor-patient, or client relationship. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or website. And because each person is so unique, all listeners are encouraged to connect with counseling and medical professionals for assistance with their personal journey. All people, places, and scenarios mentioned in the podcast have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved.
Welcome to We're Not Fine. I'm Dr. Talia Jackson.
And I'm Doug Jensen. We thank you for listening every week to our deep and thought-provoking conversations about relationships.
Hey friends, welcome to We're Not Fine, our first solo bonus episode. Do you want to know how this happened? Let me tell you. So our amazing Sterlin interview where he was talking about narcissism, and I may or may not have asked him, oh, here's Juliet, my dog. Sorry about that. I may or may not have asked him how these 27 types of narcissism have anything to do with the Enneagram, and he dove in with me and told me how every different Enneagram type has their own version of narcissism that looks just a little bit different. And I was so fascinated that our one question accidentally turned into a 45-minute episode, while my dearest pod spouse, Doug, his eyes rolled into the back of his head and he slithered off of his chair because Enneagram's just not his thing. And if it's your thing, this might be the best episode you've ever listened to. And if it's not your thing, it's okay. I still love you. And I hope you enjoyed the other bonus episodes that dropped on Tuesday. Bye, guys. Hope you love it.
So I'm in Oklahoma, Norman, Oklahoma. I teach at the University of Oklahoma, and I was kind of all over the place academically. I studied English for my undergrad, and then in my master's degree, I got a little bit more focused, I guess, and started studying. I studied counseling and focused on personality and personality disorders. So I did that in my master's degree, and then
Heaven.
Yeah, yes, yeah. I love personality typologies.
The best.
I love personality typologies. I started that in high school, specifically the Enneagram as one of my favorite personality typologies. And so then my PhD, I actually did my PhD in communication, and also taught in women's and gender studies and taught queer theory and all kinds of things. So I've dabbed a little bit in this and that, but finished my PhD in communication and then kind of went back to my psychology graduate school roots and delved more into personality psychology and got really interested in, I've always been interested in empathy as just a concept and, kind of identify as a highly sensitive person, I guess. And so I've been around some narcissists in my life, in my family and also professionally. And so it just seemed like a good time to kind of converge my interests. And so I kind of combined my interest in the Enneagram personality typology and narcissism, and came out with, did a research study and then wrote a book, The Narcissist in You and Everyone Else. So yeah, and right now I teach human relations. So I teach classes on, of course, personality. And then I also teach cultural awareness and social justice classes like that. So lots of consciousness raising kind of stuff. So yeah.
Oh my gosh. Dr. Sterlin, you are amazing. And I knew immediately that I was going to love you and I needed to have you on the show because you had me at the Enneagram. No, Doug, I mean, he has to put up with so much with the Enneagram. And so I was like, yes, narcissism. Doug and I are also in love with personality disorders. We love talking about them. We love the typology. I really want to hear about what you have to say about the typology. You were talking about 27 types of narcissism and the Enneagram. The first thing that I'm really curious about, if you feel comfortable talking about it, is how did you end up with this as a specialty and an interest? You mentioned work, love, like who were the narcissists that
in
got
my life.
you here? Like, what was your experience? We'd love to know.
It's interesting. I had a I have a couple of family members that I would consider to be on the narcissist spectrum. One of them is my grandmother, who's still living, but will never listen to this, so it's fine. So no offense, but she just doesn't. She would have no idea. So that's why I always feel comfortable talking about it, because she's like almost 90 years old and she's not listening to podcasts, but she's still kicking. But anyway, so I didn't really know that's what it was. I knew that my mom, who passed in 2021 suddenly, but I knew she had struggled with what now I recognize are the effects of narcissistic abuse from a parent. It was sort of, my grandmother's more of kind of what you might call she has a narcissistic subtype that people don't often recognize. And even I didn't recognize it until I really started to kind of delve in and go, oh, this is what the problem has been for all these years.
Foreshadowing to all the different subtypes.
Yes, a little foreshadowing there.
Chomping at the bit.
Yes. So that didn't really come into view until I started really delving into this book. And then I had a professional mentor, I guess you could say, who actually, I got a lot from that person, but they ended up being, which I saw the signs, but then didn't at the same time. I was very much in it. And then once I kind of broke away from them as a mentor, then the narcissism came out and they wanted to take ownership over everything that I had learned, and it got weird.
Wow.
So, and
it also, I think it gets really complicated when it's a mentor-mentee situation, because we're naturally in this position of, not bowing down, but like the hierarchy is we're learning. Yes. And so sometimes you can't even spot the narcissism because it's coming from a place of mentorship and guidance. And I know more than you.
Yes. Yep. Exactly that. And I didn't see it coming. And so that was, in retrospect, I can look back and point to things and go, oh, okay. Yeah, it was there. I just, you're a little bit blinded by it. And I did get a lot of value, from that dynamic, but, not uncommonly, once you kind of separate from the person or get some kind of success outside of them, that's when you'll get the kind of antagonistic features. And so that was, and that's been fairly recent in the past few years, especially since the book was published. And so those are the closest. I did have a love interest that was definitely on that spectrum.
Me too.
Yeah. I grew up really kind of admiring my grandmother. She was very, in where we live, my family's kind of well known because they were the first Black family to buy a home in Norman, and they integrated. They were, there was a lot of kind of civil rights stuff in the 60s. And my grandfather taught or teaches still actually at the University of Oklahoma. And so they're, minor kind of local celebrity family, right? And I really admired them and still do for the things that they accomplish. And my grandmother was very, being a young little gay boy, she was very worldly and classy and taught me things about culture and etiquette and all of those wonderful things, right? So I guess I didn't really notice that it was always kind of about her. Everything was always kind of about her. I did see the way in which, they had 7 children, and my mom was one of 7. And so I did see how she treated all of the children differently, and not in like the good, different way, like it was very clear who was the favorite and who wasn't. And my mom was kind of the scapegoat of the family for whatever reason, no real good reason.
Aw.
So I was always aware of this kind of, she would treat me very nicely and would hang out with me and do things with me, but then she wasn't like that with my mom. And as a kid, that was kind of hard to like, what's going on? Like, why isn't she as, as nice to my mom? And so, so there was always this kind of weird dynamic. And then my mom struggled with alcoholism, most of my life, or at least second half of my life. And I sort of got into a codependent caretaking role with her. And I would often go back to my grandparents. My grandfather's not narcissistic, but it's not as much. And they didn't care. It was sort of like, well, she's an adult, and they didn't really want to help. And so I just really didn't, I thought they were just kind of disconnected because they had so many kids, and my grandfather would step up to the plate. But my grandmother just didn't have the emotional connection. She didn't have the empathy. She couldn't show the concern. So I think as I got into this research and really started to delve really into the literature and do my own case studies, and I realized, oh, that's what this is. Like, that was the problem. And so it was something that sort of unfolded through my research, actually. And I think I probably always knew, actually, my mentor that ended up being a narcissist kind of told me that, because she called everyone else a narcissist as well. So it was kind of ironic, but yeah, yes. The effects of narcissistic abuse, generationally, especially if it's a parent or a grandparent or something like that, and how it affects the family system. And I very much see how it affected my family system. And since it was, because we had this kind of, local celebrity thing going on, there was very much a public face, we had to put on, and that it was this, great family. And then, of course, the reality of that is that it was difficult, just like many family systems.
That's right.
And so there was a lot of not kind of recognizing it or being able to kind of deal with it at the time, because there was this kind of public image that was expected, including of my mom. And so yeah, it takes some time, especially when it's someone close to you in your life. I know I've worked with clients, and I'm sure you all have too, where it's clear to you that maybe they're talking about someone that could be narcissistic, and it's, when to tell them that and how to tell them. And there's a grieving process with that.
But yeah, how do you even come up with 27 types?
Very good question. So, without getting too technical with the Enneagram, there's 9 Enneagram type personality types. And then there's these 3 instinctual types: the social instinct, the self-preservation instinct, and the sexual or intimate instinct. And so there's really 3 versions of each of the 9 types, which makes 27, right? And so as I was knowing the Enneagram, as I did, and, being certified in that and all of that good stuff. So I knew that I'd read a lot of literature about narcissism in grad school. And then as I was kind of thinking about this book, and I've seen, especially like someone like Theodore Milan, who talked a lot about he talked about different subtypes of narcissism, but they didn't line up with the Enneagram in the way that I was like, well, there has to be I knew at least 9 types of narcissism, because there's 9 different ego structures. And then the instincts, these instinctual drives that all humans have, right? The social instinct to sort of group and gather and talk about social issues, and then the self-preservation instinct, and then this intimate one-on-one bonding instinct that we all have, right? And so the 27 comes from the 27 subtypes, instinctual subtypes of the Enneagram.
Wow.
And so I knew there had to be at least 27. And so then, I developed an Enneagram test. This was prior to this research. And then from that test, which I get data about how people describe themselves, I was actually able to kind of just select out. I had thousands of people take the test, and then I selected out 200 or 300 to kind of zero in on and do follow-up interviews with, and then started seeing these 27 archetypes of narcissism come through.
Wow.
And so what I sort of postulated is that people do their narcissism, if you will, through the lens of their instinctual type and their Enneagram type. And so it has its different flavor depending on their type, right? And I personally see narcissism as kind of like a personality overlay, or some people talk about it as like a personality type. I wouldn't personally, I don't think it's quite that, but so but I think they all share similarities in the way that the narcissism shows up and what it is in the psyche, but it's enacted differently. And the focus of their narcissism will vary depending on, which Enneagram type they are.
This is so fascinating. And I'm wondering, like, what do you think the best way for us to do this is? Like, could we even just say, okay, so the type 1, here are a couple sentences. We've done 2 episodes on the Enneagram, but I'm sure people who are like Doug and not as obsessed as I am might need a refresher.
Yep.
But even like, I could throw out like, okay, type 1, here are 2 sentences, and then you could tell us the subtypes.
Yeah, I mean, I could do that. I mean, I think that
What would you prefer?
yeah, I'm trying to like in my latest book that I'm writing, I'm trying to kind of pare it down to give people the Cliff's Notes version of the first book when they want to delve into the 27 subtypes. So it'll be good practice for me to kind of elevator pitch it. But I think that that's a good way to approach it. We definitely could look at just the nine different Enneagram types. And because I think that clustering them that way might be more digestible, and I think people can get it. And then we could think of the 27 as just variations on a theme of each type.
Love it. Okay. So first type.
Yes.
The number 1 is the reformer, the perfectionist. When they're healthy, they're all about integrity, rules, doing the right thing. Things are black and white. There's a right, there's a wrong. When they're unhealthy, it tends to be more critical. They feel certain that because they're focusing on best practices and that they show up more, stronger, better than others, that their way is the right way.
Yes, right. Correct. So that particular type, I think of, I call these the kind of self-righteous, rigid narcissistic types. So oftentimes if there is narcissism present, it will be more morally focused. They will often see themselves as morally superior than other people. They tend to, not hesitate to correct other people's behavior. So you get the grandiosity, but it's more in the ethical kind of moral realm. And you're going, typically with the 1, you're going to get less of the kind of flashiness you may get from some of the other types, less of the attention-seeking kind of qualities, and more kind of punitive rigidity with that kind of narcissism. I had a client who was that, or who's had a mother who was that type, and she refused to buy her kids anything new. So they never got new toy, even though she had plenty of money and actually did really well, because she wanted them to learn the austerity of having, secondhand things. But then she would buy designer clothes for herself. So there was this sort of disparity. So there's often a moral kind of high ground that the 1 will take when they'll do that anyway, but with narcissism, It's hard to break.
The lessons. They want the lessons. They'll die on that hill. Oh my God.
Yes, exactly.
Type 2, the helper, the giver. The healthy version of this type, I mean, they're incredibly relationship oriented. They are altruistic. They give, and it feels good to give because their boundaries are good and their self-care is good. And so it's an authentic experience of giving and receiving with these types. Right. They will still probably drop everything and show up for you. They're going to buy the most thoughtful gifts. You can never out-gift a 2. They always are going to be more thoughtful than you. An unhealthy 2 is a martyr, and they resentfully give because they're not holding any boundaries for themselves. They never say no, and then they begrudge you what they're doing for you. They need to be needed. They need you to be grateful. There's a lot of passive aggressive, maladaptive stuff.
Yes.
Add anything you want to that.
Yeah, I would add one of the things that was kind of left out of 2 is their willfulness. So they're actually a very willful type, and the original teachings from Oscar Chazo and then later Claudio Naranjo talked about that he actually described them as the most aggressive type on the Enneagram. And if you and actually it makes sense if you know a two, and they may be really sweet about it. They catch more, bees with honey than, but they really are pressing for what they want. So they think they know best what other people want and need. And that's because they need to be significant in the lives of others, right? They need people to need them. And so they will kind of insert themselves in people's lives as a way of being indispensable because they're afraid of being indispensable. So when
there's fascinating because I get 2s and 8s sometimes when I meet a person. I'm like, they're a 2, but they're so aggressive about their 2-ness, and I think that means they're an 8, but they're clearly just a 2.
Yeah, they could very well be a 2. 8s are the difference is that the 2 is hiding. They're sort of burying the lead, right? They're not telling you what it is they want or need, whereas the 8s, it's more of a direct kind of quid pro quo. Like, okay, well, I'll do this for you. You do this for me. We're clean, right? The 2 can't do that, right? Because they can't need anything. So it has to be for you. So they're more manipulative in that way. I think we've made manipulative a bad word in our culture, but
it's true.
It's true. They get a lot done that way, and they can be very ambitious and successful. I think of someone like, Kris Jenner, right? Who's like the momager. I see her as like a 2, but she's very, pushy in a lot of ways, and they can really help people to be successful. Power behind the throne sometimes. So when they're narcissistic, I call the 2s the prideful, flattering types. So pride is a problem for 2s in general, and when there's narcissism involved, it's very, very hard for them to see any way in which they've been selfish or self-absorbed or anything like that, right? So my grandmother is a 2. And so that's why I was saying it was difficult to see, because what they will do often is they will shower their attention on one person, and sort of, it's a way to let other people know, like, if you're good, or if you give me what I want, then you can have this attention and this adoration. But if you're not, then I'm going to freeze you out and you don't exist, right? And so they will often sort of spotlight different people, and then that's their project, right? At the time, they see themselves as benevolent and kind and loving. When narcissism is there, they're often can be very selfish and self-absorbed, and there's a lot of kind of, I hate the term, but kind of histrionic emotion that can go with 2 in general. But when there's narcissism there, it can be amplified. So they're confusing because they seem helpful and loving and kind and supportive, but then there's this dichotomy where they can be really selfish and harsh and difficult to please.
Incredible. I feel like I'm learning so much. I'm so excited. Okay. The 3, right?
Yes.
These guys are the achievers. And I'd say a healthy version of a 3. They are as amazing as they seem. They do know themselves. They do their work. They care about real connections with people. As the unhealthy, it's much more image oriented. They're sort of a shell of a person. It's a little like empty, and I like what you like, because there's a constant need for external approval and climbing up the ladder. So I feel like a lot of narcissists, and this is so interesting, because when I think of narcissists, I often think of like the 3s and the 8s.
Yeah.
But I love that because I'm a 7, and I see my own narcissism sometimes. And so this is just fascinating.
Yeah, no, you're that's astute, because the 3, 7, and 8 were the types, the 3 assertive types, right? That you can see the narcissism more clearly just because the energy is out and confident, and so I get that. And I think the way we think about narcissism, and often the way that it's written about, very much you think about 3, right? This image conscious, status driven, success focused person that's only focused on themselves and all of that. And so I call the narcissistic variations of 3 the ambitious, deceptive types, right? So these are the they are probably the 3 7s and 8s are probably the most prototypical narcissistic looking, at least in terms of traditional descriptions of narcissism. And the narcissistic 3 is very focused on image and success, and there's not a lot of inner development. It's sort of shameless attention seeking, although you do get that with 2 as well. They're very attention seeking. But the narcissistic 3 is not as relationally focused. 2s are focused on relationships and people, and the 3 is focused on success and moving up. Now, they want people to think highly of them, so they often will deceive people or adopt an image that maybe isn't authentic, often isn't authentic, in order to get what they want. They can be very slick and charming, and but they sort of embody the kind of superficiality sometimes we think about that runs with narcissism. And honestly, we tend to reward that kind of person, especially in celebrity culture and politics. They tend to get pretty far, actually. I think we reward narcissists fairly well in our culture. So they fly under the radar a lot.
So good. So type 4, the romantic, the individualist, the tortured artist, when they're healthy, they are like creative geniuses. They're just like these visionaries that they see the world in very interesting ways. They're often like actors and creatives and writers and dancers and playwrights. And what I always say about the 4 is that they find themselves to be sort of uniquely special and uniquely fucked up all at the same time, that nobody understands them. They're such an individual because they're very othered. They're misunderstood. When they're unhealthy, there's a lot of like sitting in the otherness, that everyone else has it better, the comparative, everyone else's life is better, everyone else has, I'm just dark and alone and sitting in the misery.
Yeah. That's a perfect description, especially as a 4. So this is my type. I'm like, yeah, that's it. It's hard to teach your own type. Actually, I always have to take myself out of myself to talk about it, but that's a good description. And I think that, and weirdly in recent years, the 4 has become everybody thinks they want to be a 4. And I'm like, I don't know why that is, but I think it's because people think you're creative and unique. And I'm like, but they're forgetting all the other stuff that goes along with it. But so when narcissism is present, I call these the moody entitled types. So the way that narcissism tends to develop for the 4 is it's what I call a lot of compensatory narcissism, right? So I'm this awful fairy tale monster that has it worse than everybody else and nobody understands me, but then I'm also this special rare flower and people don't appreciate me and don't understand, my genius, right? So you kind of get both like a negative narcissism and then a grandiose narcissism together when narcissism is present with the 4. And there's a lot of emotional entitlement. A lot of the 4s in my research that I talked to were very much felt like other people, they deserved for other people to take care of their basic needs. They didn't feel like they needed to work or had to work because they were so creative and they needed to do their creative pursuits, or they were too sensitive, or whatever the case is. So a lot of excusing oneself from behaving and acting as regular people do. And then also very emotionally controlling, because the 4 has this inner sense of inadequacy and lack. They often in their relationships expected others, when narcissism was present, expected others to sort of fill them up in a way that no one else could really do, right? So it was a lot of emotional, walking on eggshells around the 4, and people feeling kind of emotionally controlled by them.
Oh, let's move on to the 5, right? The observer. I feel like there are other names for this type. What
the investigator, the remote investigator, anything around that kind of
but
realm.
a little more introverted, like a healthy 5, usually very intellectual. They're the scientists, they're the engineers, they see things in a way no one else sees them. And unhealthy might be a little bit more othered, reclusive. If I never see another human as long as I live, that's fine. Lower than average relationship needs, kind of a loner.
Yes. Yeah. The 5 sense of self comes from being, sense of safety and security comes from being someone who's knowledgeable, who's learned. There's a fear of being incompetent and of being, that 8 also has, and of being overwhelmed by other people's demands. So social demands, emotional demands. 5s often, 4s and 5s often have that alien kind of feel in the world, and 5s, yeah, I think 5 is really the most sensitive type on the Enneagram. They are very sensitive in a lot of ways, but you wouldn't know it because you get kind of the porcupine energy instead of, inviting them in. But the ego's kind of attached to their intellect and their knowledge, right? How much they know, and they kind of can hoard things in that respect. So I call the narcissistic version the remote intellectual type. So they, yeah, you were absolutely right. 5s in general kind of isolate themselves from other people because of that fear of being overwhelmed. But the narcissistic 5, that hoarding instinct that many 5s have, where it's like, I got to hold on to everything because I don't know if I'm going to have enough for me. That's kind of baked into 5 in general. When you add narcissism to it, you get a very kind of, like Ebenezer Scrooge kind of thing. He's actually a 5, the archetype of a 5, and also a narcissist, right? So you get someone who's can be really stingy with their time, with their emotions. They can be really, because they feel alien, they feel like other people don't really matter, so they don't value emotions. They can see people very much objectify people in a lot of ways. They can be very shrewd, business people, and make really tough decisions because they're not really taking people's emotions into consideration. So, so remote and kind of cantankerous, I think, is a good way of talking about them, and very intellectually arrogant. They tend to think they're the smartest person in the room, always. So,
It's so good. So the 6, the loyalist, the trooper, they run kind of anxious. They're very security focused. They're very relationship oriented in, a security community kind of way, loyal, rooting for the underdog. Community is important. Maybe when they're unhealthy, they're suspicious. They are wondering, are you with me or are you against me? And really, really worried about security. The phobic, the counterphobic, who's still terrified but fighting it anyway.
Yeah. Yes. The 6, I always like to say the 6 is the most complex type on the Enneagram. They're the hardest to type, and they have a hard time finding their type on the Enneagram because the fear is of not having certainty, right? So they seek outside confirmation because they're skeptical and they're not sure of themselves, and so they need certainty and security. And so you said that really well. But they are really emotionally complex. They're scanning for danger and looking for inconsistencies and always looking for ways just to feel more safe and secure. And they really want to trust themselves. And until they trust themselves, they can't really trust other people. So there's always this sort of push-pull with trust and security. And so when there's narcissism involved, I call these the anxious, skeptical types. And so they often expect other people to cater to their anxiety. They will often weaponize their anxiety if they're more phobic, meaning they, shrink away from things they're afraid of, and they'll sort of control people with their anxieties and their fears. And they also, the 6 in general, it tends to be mistrustful of people that are very confident because they aren't. And so they will often, if there's narcissism involved, they often seek to undermine people's confidence, and they will undermine them or undermine, especially in like a professional setting. It's not uncommon that the narcissistic 6 will try to take down someone they've decided isn't safe, or and they can kind of just go after people because of this fear they have of being controlled or dominated. And so they end up being we often talk about the 6 as the persecuted persecutor, right? So they think they're persecuted, and then because of that, they'll justify persecuting other people. And the sort of skepticism and paranoia that we talk about with 6 gets really heightened when there's narcissism involved. And so you can get somebody who, on the one hand, can seem really disarming and funny and sometimes engaging, and then on the other hand, be really undermining and provocative in a lot of ways and argumentative.
Wow.
Yeah.
Sterlin, you are like a Enneagram genius. So the 7, my type, and Doug is the 8, right? So the 7, like when they're healthy, it's just genuine joy, adventure, life, loving the best the life has to offer. And when they're unhealthy, it's really scattered, overwhelmed, will bite your own arm off to avoid a painful situation, very avoidant, doesn't finish what they start.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think I see the 7 as, they're the planner, right? They're always planning the next big thing or the next thing that's exciting. They're seeking joy and positivity, and they're upbeat, but they're also a mental type. So there's a lot of intellectual kind of, they're fascinated, right? They're fascinated by new things and new theories and new ideas. And the 7 is also they are running away from pain, right? They're running away from, the fear is, it's sort of like you can't catch a moving target. So the 7's always on the move, right? Because if they feel like if they slow down too much, then all the emotional kind of, negativity they feel like they've been avoiding will catch up to them. So they're kind of always on the move, and that's the way the anxiety shows up in the 7. And with narcissism present, I call these the hedonistic exuberant types. So there's a lot of hedonism with 7 in general. But when narcissism is present, you get somebody who is, again, a little bit more the prototypical kind of example of narcissism, can be very selfish, but also can be very charming. And 7s are in general, but they can, a 7 can talk you into a paper bag, right? If they're excited about it, and they can get you excited about it. And if there's narcissism present, they often will have a lot of plans and ideas that they either can't execute or don't really plan to execute. And so they can kind of enroll people in things, and, will be, sometimes can be dishonest and mislead people. And then they also, in some of my research, I came across quite a few 7s, one of the flavors of the 7 narcissistic types, who will sometimes just want people to do silly or dangerous or humiliating things just for their enjoyment, right? Just because it's funny to them and they think it would be interesting. And so you that can run with it. And there's a lot of kind of charlatanism with the 7, right? Where it's kind of the P.T. Barnum, let me sell you a dream, but there's nothing really behind it. And so that's often the way I see the 7 narcissism showing up. And so sometimes it's easier to recognize 7s when they are narcissistic, because I think 3s, 7s, and 8s, like I said, I think it kind of matches with those types, our popular conception of it.
I'll be sure to have Rob skip over that one section in this episode. Okay, so 8s. I have so many beloved 8s in my life. I love my 8s, right? And everything's about level of health. So 8s, I always say, like, they're the leaders, they're the mentors, they're the executives, they're the bosses, they're the presidents. They are champions of a cause, of the underdog. They are really confident for the most part. And what I like to say is they have big dick energy, and they're like main character energy. Yes. And when they're unhealthy, it's stepping over dead bodies to get to the top of the ladder, and sort of very unhealthy leadership that can sometimes be abusive. And I feel like narcissism.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. The 8 is, the core fear of the 8 is of being vulnerable, right? So the 8 in general avoids vulnerability, showing vulnerability or weakness. And so, we often say, sometimes people will be like, well, 8s are so courageous. And I'm like, well, they're not courageous, but they don't even have the fear come up to be courageous. So they often sort of like just go into a situation and they're like, what, that's just what I needed to be done, or I just said what needed to be said. And there wasn't a lot of fear or anxiety around it. So they're just bold, right? And I think you're absolutely right when we look at narcissism, especially the kind of narcissism with psychopathy, right? So, and I don't mean literal psychopaths, but just like the archetype of psychopathy, right? So the rage with any 8 is right there anyway, because there's this fear of being sort of overtaken or overpowered, right? So they become the dominating ones. And I think when there's narcissism present, that becomes the primary feature of the personality. Donald Trump, I think he's an 8, and I think he's narcissistic. Yeah. So very, clearly so. Not in a political way, just that's what it is.
Not in a cute way either.
It's a really great, we see it, right? And you can see all the ways in which it comes up. And so there is this kind of mafia don kind of, that when narcissism is present, it can come up that way. There's a tyrant quality, right? And they can become really domineering, really aggressive, my way or the highway, complete rejection of vulnerability or softness, and even bullying other, when we think of a healthy 8, they are protecting others, right? They never really see themselves as protecting themselves, but there's always someone who needs their protection, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the healthy version of 8. Well, when it's narcissism present, they become the bully, right? They become the tyrant. And of course, in their mind, they're still protecting someone else. But really, it's all self-serving, right? Really, it's all protecting their own interests and their own power. And they aren't as able to adjust. A lot of the other narcissistic subtypes can kind of color over it with enough charm maybe to get by, and because the 8 is kind of take it as it is, it's hard for them to do that. So when there's narcissism present, it really is like a Mack truck all the time. And you make it, not that they can be very charismatic and charming, but you get that bold kind of aggressiveness coming through.
And the last one, the 9, the peacemaker, is just, I think about them just like right on a fence. They agree with you, and then they turn over here and agree with you. And it's like keeping the peace at all cost, that they don't really stand up for themselves, and they become sort of a passive person between more aggressive people fighting over them. Maybe when they're unhealthy. I think when they're healthy, they're just like happy. If you're happy, legitimately, like a great support person.
Right. Yeah. The 9 is, we often say the 9 has an ego about not having an ego, right? So they kind of erase themselves in a lot of ways and become, very amicable, and they are terrified of conflict. So they sort of natural mediators. And they want to maintain their inner comfort and their relational comfort, right? They just want everything to be copacetic and comfortable and nice and easy. And when there's narcissism present, I call these the ambivalent, neglectful types. It's hard. Sometimes people really miss narcissism in the 9 because it isn't. Not that there might not be grandiosity there, but because it's 9, you don't see that as much. You still may see someone who's pretty easygoing and chill and calm, but where it shows up is their neglectfulness. Mm-hmm. They neglect themselves. 9s do this anyway, and so then they end up neglecting their relationships. And because the 9 already tells themselves, well, what I need and want doesn't matter. When there's narcissism there, they still kind of have that, but then they've also decided what you need and want doesn't matter either, right? So they have a really hard time having any kind of emotional conversation about anything, or if someone comes to them with a conflict or a complaint or a grievance, they're very, very dismissive. But they often seem still easygoing and laid back. And so it's a kind of subtle narcissism where it's just more neglectful. And they can also randomly kind of rage out, right? So the 9 just suppresses their rage, the 8's right up front. And so when the 9 is narcissistic, you're going to get more of the narcissistic rage that'll come out, which is kind of opposed to their normal easygoing personality. So people miss the narcissism in the 9 very frequently. because of that. So I have my author website, which is just sterlinmosley.com. And then I also have an Enneagram consulting and coaching business called Empathy Architects. And I do that with my best friend. And we've been studying the Enneagram for 20 years. And we have a podcast called Do You Know You, which is all about talk about the Enneagram and all that stuff. And then also on Instagram, we post a lot on there. And so that's at Empathy Architects on social media. And so, yeah, those are the primary places you can find me.
And you're just a delight. I'm so grateful that you came on.
One of the better podcasts, I'd have to say, that I've done. So you guys are a lot of fun. So I love